The United States is assembling one of the largest naval strike forces in the history of the war off the Vietnamese coast.
Have you carried out the order that I gave last night, 12 hours ago, regard to using naval gunfire on the road above the DMZ in North Vietnam? Yes, sir. Get all the cruisers and destroyers in the 7th Fleet in that area and get in there as fast as you can. Yes, sir.
We have to be thinking in terms of an all-out bombing attack. Now, by an all-out bombing attack, I am thinking of things that go far beyond. I'm thinking of dikes. I'm thinking of natural railroad. I'm thinking, of course, the docks.
Within the past week, there have been reports of eyewitnesses claiming to have seen American planes hit dikes and dams. And the question is, has such bombing occurred?
Mr. Rather, we have had orders out not to hit dikes because the result in terms of civilian casualties would be extraordinary.
American jets and destroyers got the green light today and struck back with a vengeance against targets in North Vietnam.
Oh, life could be a dream. Shaboom, if I could take you up in paradise up above. Shaboom, you tell me, darling, I'm the only one that you love. Life could be a dream. Sweetheart, hello, hello again. Shaboom, and hope we meet again. Boom, boom, boom. Ding dong, ding dong, la lang la lang la lang la lang la oh, bip, a bip, oh, but oh, life could be a dream. Life could be a dream. Do, 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 shaboom.
Yeah, that was one thing I wanted to point out, actually. I mean, Nixon's born in, like, 1913 or something like that.
Yeah, right.
And his formative years would have been the 20s, really, and coming up in the 30s. Yeah, like, he would have had... His mindset would have been very, well, pretty old-fashioned. And, you know, he played the game so well in his earlier career that I think he expected to just sort of get away with this sort of thing.
Yeah.
The Nixon administration, apart before Watergate, had various corruption things going on with it. There was an ITT corruption case. I won't go into that. It's kind of boring. But it was just that there was the whiff of corruption before. And later we'll get into his vice president, Spiro Agnew, had to resign, completely separate to 100% separate to Nixon and the Watergate.
Yeah,
he had to resign.
It was Gerald Ford stepped in, and then he had to step in again when Nixon resigned. When Nixon resigned, right? So
that's right. Yeah, Ford was the most unlikeliest guy ever
yeah,
to end up as president.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, people say that
double whammy, like
yeah,
somehow fluked his way twice into the top job. Yeah, brilliant.
People say that Spiro Agnew sort of was in on Nixon's stuff, not necessarily directly involved, but just in general knew what Tricky Dick was all about. And that he was a safe pair of hands should Nixon ever have to resign. Well, no, I mean, Agnew was thought of as a bit of a joke. So people, right. It was like Nixon's insurance that the Senate and or Congress would never impeach him or try and get rid of him because you're left with Agnew, which is a joke.
Jesus.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, some people said that.
Yeah.
So yeah, back to, on the tapes, the next day, June 21st, 1972, Nixon's just talking about, in general terms, how to cover it up, really, how to cover up their connection to these guys, this Liddy and Hunt and James McCord. And this gets into the FBI at this point. So, as I mentioned before, J. Edgar Hoover was leader of the director of the FBI for life, but he died, he popped his clogs in May. He just died, had a heart attack and died. And so, for the first time, the FBI needed a new leader. Like, J. Edgar Hoover he was the FBI, he was Mr. FBI.
Yeah, totally, yeah.
So when he died, there's a power vacuum, really, within the FBI. The guy directly under him, a guy called Mark Felt, had been there a long time. He was FBI through and through. But Nixon, and it's a presidential appointment, Nixon didn't really want that. He wanted his own guy in there, you know. He saw a chance to sort of break open the FBI a bit, you know, not have them... They're completely their own power structure. If you've got his guy at the top, well, that was Nixon's calculation. And so he had put a guy in there called Patrick Gray, and Patrick Gray was a bit of a bureaucrat. He hadn't been in the FBI before. He was just a really, really senior.
No way. So
government guy.
That's crazy.
Yeah. But it turns out that was a bit of a weak move because he couldn't really control them. He didn't really.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, that's mad. Like they've gone from like a legend, the guy who started, like who presided
Yeah.
over the FBI, like
Yeah, and turn them from just another thing into the most powerful, law
federal.
enforcement.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then to suddenly get someone, so you've got this entire power structure underneath. It was like his personal agency in a lot of ways, and then to get someone who's a complete outsider, that was never going to work, right? I mean,
Well, yeah, a lot of it rested on this guy, Patrick Gray, being sort of a formidable character, I suppose, and he wasn't. And so this is in May, so just a few months, not long before the break-in happens at all. And so, the day J. Edgar Hoover dies, they get the next guy, but he's there as like an interim director of the FBI, and he still needs to get okayed by the Senate, green-lighted by the Senate. But so on June 21st, Nixon just asks his guys, Haldeman, to just speak to Pat Gray and just get him to back off. That's literally what they talk about. Can we just call up Pat Gray and get him to stop the FBI from investigating these Watergate burglars?
Now the investigation, the Democratic break-in thing, the FBI investigation is now leading into some productive areas because they've been able to trace the money and it goes some directions we don't want it to go. But the way to handle this now is for us to just say, stay the hell out of this. This is there's business here we don't want you going any further on. Got it. Good deal. Play it, tell them. That's the way they play it. That's the way we're going to play it. Okay.
Now that's dodgy right there. That's not really okay right there. I mean, I don't know to what extent it's a president's privilege to do things like that.
well,
But they don't go into
explicit. Not supposed to get involved in judicial matters like that, are they? They're not supposed to interfere in, like they can grant pardons and stuff, but other than.
Oh yeah, we'll get into the nature of presidential pardons
Right.
at the end, but I mean, sorry, go on.
No, I was going to say that there's supposed to be a clear delineation between. I mean, it's supposed to just enact law, right? They're supposed to, I mean, obviously over time they've become more and more powerful, but the president isn't supposed to have that kind of power at all, or anything like that. It's just traditional that they've gathered more kind of active political power to themselves over the years, but no, that kind of interference in agencies investigating a crime is surely not cool, not cool at all.
Yeah, I mean, because technically the director of the FBI is an employee of the federal government, and the president is the head of the federal government. So you can sort of make the argument that Nixon is Pat Gray's boss. But yeah, you're right. Where do the constitutional lines separating the powers, where do they begin and end? And this sort of thing is at the heart of the Nixon and Watergate case, but it becomes pretty clear. This is just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, it's funny when Haldeman talks to Nixon, especially when they're on their own, the way Haldeman is kind of cryptic about what he says. He mentions on this day that Hunt was involved in, quote, a lot of stuff. It's crazy. Nixon doesn't ask what that is. Doesn't say, wait a minute, what do you mean, what a lot of stuff? What a lot of stuff? What the fuck are you talking about? Yeah, I think Nixon even says on this day, certainly says it later, don't tell me. Explicitly says, well, don't tell me. He starts asking for details and then he interrupts himself and says, oh no, wait, I don't want to know. It's so you can, when you're under oath, or if you have to give a subpoenaed statement or something, you can say that lawyer bullshit. You can say, well, I actually didn't know.
Yeah.
Don't ever mention that you asked not to know, but anyway.
Yeah, and you totally, you know, really, you just don't know.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah, you still do know. Nixon's described as a control freak, like to micromanage things. I mean, he definitely comes to try to micromanage Watergate. Yeah, there's no way we would know. It's like that strange argument that some Holocaust deniers have, that there's no direct order from Hitler anywhere on paper. So he didn't know. He might not have known. It was all Himmler. It's like, well, no, come on. There's just no way. There's just no way that's possible. So it's one of those things. Nixon doesn't actually want to know the details, but they just talk about how they should try and blame it on Liddy and don't let it go any further than Liddy, the level of Liddy. Actually, at one point on this day, Nixon says something that's crazy to Haldeman, and Haldeman doesn't act on it. and it's not really one of the things that you first hear about when if you ever look into the Nixon tapes and the Watergate tapes. There's a few kind of semi-famous lines or bits that really nail him down, and this one doesn't really come up. But Nixon says to Haldeman, "Why don't we plant a bug on ourselves and get the FBI to sort of point the FBI towards it, to them investigate it, and then we can claim we're being bugged by the Democrats or whoever, and that when that gets out to the public, to the press, everyone will think, oh, they're all bugging each other, and that's just how the game's played." And
Wow,
yeah.
man.
And
That's
Nixon
amazing.
says, "Let's bug ourselves." Yeah.
What? And they just don't do it.
Yeah, Haldeman doesn't really say anything, and certainly doesn't do it.
Oh man.
But yeah, I mean, at this early stage, like I say, this is just a few days since the break-in, not even a week, and no one really thinks, I don't think at this point, that it's going to bring down Nixon or anything.
No,
and
I mean, why would you? Yeah, but I guess it's surprising just knowing the way that they would deal with stuff like this now, where they just cut people off, don't they? If there's a scandal around David Cameron, like they just close ranks around him. Like Cameron would step away from the issue entirely, right? And then you would find a scapegoat, wouldn't they? They'd just immediately find, right, someone's going to take the fall for this. Let's just find someone quickly, anyone. Who can plausibly take the fall, and Cameron just don't get involved in any way whatsoever, don't speak to the press about it. They're just much more sophisticated about dealing with stuff now, whereas I guess it seems crazy that Nixon would take such an active role in like discussing stuff which is being recorded, and either way could come back on him. The main thing you should do is shut it down, right? Just like throw someone to the wolves, get it solved and survive the situation. That's crazy, like suggesting they plant evidence and try and create this weird other narrative. That's like the opposite of what you should do.
Absolutely. But I think at this point already, Nixon knows that he fostered a climate of dirty tricks, for want of a better word.
So it's too late for him. It's like once it comes
Yeah.
out, he's done all this shit for ages.
It feels like it would have been just a reversal of the way he had always operated if he was at this point to say, okay, everyone stop. All senior staff come in. I want everyone to tell me exactly what you know in as much detail. And then if I have to go directly to the FBI with some clean FBI agents and do a house cleaning and so forth. But that would have been, as I say, a complete reversal of how he'd always operated. And also that would only make sense if he had nothing to hide. The taping thing would be fine if you were clean. I like to think if I was president or something, I would quite like to have a taping system that Nixon had. But, I wouldn't be corrupt. And then it's a good thing, because if you realise too late that one of your senior aides is dodgy, and he's like being cryptic with what he is or isn't telling you about criminal matters that your office is involved in, that'd be great to have that on tape if you were clean,
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
But anyway, they weren't. The next day, June 22nd, Nixon actually has his first press conference. It wasn't a televised one. It was just sort of an informal thing. They brought a lot of reporters into the Oval Office. I'm not sure if they do that much anymore. I think that's how it used to be done a lot back in the days of Truman and stuff.
So he's sitting behind his desk, sort of thing, and they
or just leaning against his desk, and they just usher in a whole bunch of journalists, and they just have sort of a conversation, and the journalists can report it, but there's no cameras, I don't think.
That sounds so crazily old-fashioned, doesn't it? That sounds
like I say,
19th century sort of old-fashioned, like.
It's the early 70s, but a lot of stuff is operating like it's the 40s or 50s, I feel like, a lot of the time.
Like you said, a lot of that generation are still are the ones in power, so I guess that makes sense. I get that impression a lot during. That's one of the reasons this feels so interesting to me, is the fact that it's like you said, you've got this guy who's someone who's got a maybe 1930s mindset, and obviously has got older as the world's got older, but like he's sort of found himself in a different in a world that's changed, possibly because of this scandal, but also just because of like wider social changes and stuff, the world has become more open, or America at least has become more open, and you've got protesters and stuff, and you've got counterculture going on that's all emerging at this time,
Oh
and
yeah,
he's
well,
got this
totally.
he's got this old-fashioned attitude that has there found itself in a world that will no longer just respect authority to the extent it did when he was forming his patterns of behaviour.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. By this stage, the counterculture is in full swing. By this stage, Washington was, by some accounts anyway, it sounds like it was really under siege. The White House was actually under siege. There's loads of buses. They'd got loads of buses and cordoned off all around the White House because there were just constant 24/7 protesters. You know, loads of students apparently were being bussed in from all over America. They really resented the draft. That was one of the main
Sure,
things.
well, yeah.
And the death toll, of course. And that it seemed that Nixon's bombing of Cambodia and North Vietnam and South Vietnam was just a bit crazy. At one point, it's a bit later in the story, but I think it's quite a good anecdote, when Nixon can't sleep and he goes out to the Lincoln Memorial and sort of talks to a few students that are there. And it's a really weird episode that doesn't really make sense. You feel like maybe Nixon is kind of coming apart for the first time.
Okay, Bob, we're just wrapping, my friends and I. In fact, we agree on a lot of things, don't we?
No, we don't. You say you want to end the war, so why don't you?
Change always comes slowly. I pulled out more than half the troops. I'm trying to cut the military budget for the first time in 30 years. I want a volunteer army, but it's also a question of American credibility, our position in the world.
Come on, Mr. Nixon. It's a civil war between Vietnamese.
You don't want the war. We don't want the war. The Vietnamese don't want the war. So why does it go on?
We should be going, Mr. President. Okay. Please.
You can't stop it, can you? Even if you wanted to. Because it's not you. It's the system. The system won't let you stop it.
There's more at stake here than what you want or what I want.
Then what's the point? What's the point of being president? You're powerless.
No, I'm not powerless. Because I understand the system. I believe I can control it. Maybe not control it totally, but tame it enough to make it do some good.
Sounds like you're talking about a wild animal.
Yeah, maybe I am.
This is a few months after June 72, but when his senior aides turn up and rescue him, more or less, like, what the hell are you doing? It's the middle of the night. Nixon's like, we're all going to walk back to the White House. And they're like, well, you can't. It's even though you're the president, you can't do that. It's under siege. We couldn't get in. You have to take your presidential limousine through the Secret Service checkpoints. We can't just walk to the White House. So that's how much under siege it was.
Yeah.
And Nixon just calls them bums a lot.
Yeah.
His language is absolutely terrible. Calling people cocksuckers a lot. Goddamn cocksuckers. That's one of his favourites. He doesn't drop the C-bomb, but he drops the F-bomb quite a lot. He's quite rude about people. At one point he runs through all the Supreme Justices, and he calls some of them boobs. Like, oh, he's a boob. Oh, he's good. He's all right. He's one of us. Oh, he's a boob. Yeah, just like I say, old-fashioned, like kind of 30s, 40s, 50s sort of language. And they do use the same sort of terminology a lot. They talk about, when they're talking about trying to cover up Watergate, they just talk about turning it off. We just need to turn the investigation off. Oh, I thought we'd turned that off already.
Wow.
Yeah, they say the same things all the time. Talk about getting your tail caught in a crack. They say that a lot. But yeah, Haldeman particularly.
Some, proper old cockamamie, old-fashioned language, isn't it?
Yeah. Nixon at one point says, "What's all that jackassery going on down there?" I thought that was particularly funny.
Does anyone say ballyhoo at any point?
Not quite. Nixon's a bit like, Haldeman's a bit like that. Haldeman always calls it a sticky wicket. Which
is an English term, right?
Yeah, I was going to say, in Britain, you've got to be quite well spoken, quite posh to use that term without being ironic.
Yeah.
Right? I sticky wicket. I don't know.
There's a lot of that early 20th century East Coast, mid-Atlantic type culture, wasn't there? That
yeah, they're like Anglophiles.
The poshest, that Anglophile thing, that kind of.
A lot of them are like that. You know, when Family Guy do a parody of a sort of a posh East Coast American, and they sound almost British, don't they?
Yeah, yeah.
Fielding Wellingtonsworth? Hello. Livingston Winsterford? Yes. Amelia Bedford Furthington Chesterhill?
Good day.
And James William Bottomtooth. Oh, no.
But yeah, so they just acting a bit like gods, really. They talk about how what judges may or may not be put on to try these Watergate burglars, and talk about whether the judges will be, quote, programmable or not. You know, it's just trying to subvert justice, really, all the time.
And that, I'm sure that shit goes on now, but they're just so much more sophisticated about it. You know, they would never be caught saying stuff. Not that they wouldn't say it, but they wouldn't be caught saying it so much. And I'm sure they'd just be much more circumspect about it. Because I'm sure that stuff goes on now. You can see like famous prosecutions and stuff that's happening in the world today that are clearly politically influenced. The state will close ranks, and somehow like a sympathetic judge will be the one who tries the case and all that kind of shit. Like that just totally goes on. But
like Deep Cut, you know how that just seems to be the establishment just covering up for the Ministry of Defence. Yeah, I think that sort of stuff does go on all the time, but the people at the very top just don't bug themselves, and then
yeah, it's just so interesting to hear the way they actually speak to each other like that. It's crazy, isn't it? Like that you can just hear them, you can hear the conversations. It's amazing.
Yeah, and it puts, I think, it puts paid to the lie that Nixon is like this great political player, that he's a genius at the game of politics. That was sort of his reputation, even after, and he's just not. And he's like a great mind. He's not. He can barely get 2 or 3 sentences out before he misspeaks all the time. Even in press conferences, you know, they're just on YouTube. You can see him, and there's usually not more than a few sentences before he says a word wrong and has to correct himself. He's not great at all. I think he got into his position just by playing dirty tricks throughout, you know, the 40s and 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
I don't think he was particularly bright. I definitely think Haldeman is kind of thick. Well, I mean, on a scale, on a curve of thickness. I mean, he's still in some ways super bright, but some of the decisions they make and the way they talk about it, you say, "Are you kidding me? Is this for real?" Well, that gets into something else that I want to talk about a bit later as well, about are some of these conversations contrived? Because it feels like they are, some of them, later as well. They go, "Did you know about that? I didn't know about that. You didn't know about that, did you? No, I didn't know about that." And
yeah, must have.
But anyway, some of them, yeah. But then later and after, they talk about really, really sensitive things that nail them to the cross. So it's weird. It's weird. But the next day, June 23rd, this is one of the 2 big days. This is what much later in the trials, the tapes from this day become known as the smoking gun. Because on this day, Haldeman comes back to Nixon and he's tried to lean on Pat Gray at the FBI to turn off their investigation. And Pat Gray just says, "Well, I can't, even if he tries to." He's just like, "I can't do that. I don't control them. You know, I haven't got that sort of authority."
He's been in the job about a month or something, and he
exactly.
He doesn't know anyone there.
Yeah, exactly. So Nixon says that they want to play the CIA angle, because James McCord, one of the 5 burglars caught breaking in, used to be in the CIA. The Watergate break-in wasn't orchestrated by the CIA, but James McCord used to be in the CIA. Howard Hunt used to be in the CIA. Gordon Liddy did stuff where the CIA helped him in the past. So, yeah, it's not a CIA operation at all, not remotely. But to the FBI, who just the normal FBI agents that are trying to investigate this, think that it's a CIA job because a few of the people involved in it
Because yeah,
are
everyone
CIA.
they turn there, yeah, and
Yeah.
I guess I know probably 90% of the stuff I know from about the CIA from either movies or Tom Clancy novels. But it seems to me like you kind of you don't necessarily ever leave the CIA, or you officially leave the CIA, but you can be like a contractor or whatever and still do security work or whatever for them on the down low as a deniable, like that's the way they kind of operate, right? They can deny someone's really working for them even when they really are by having them leave, right? I'm
Yeah.
sure that's a thing. So yeah, that would totally make sense.
Yeah. And when they brought these guys before a judge, just a normal sort of district judge, a few days after they were caught, and you're sort of asked to stand up and state what your profession is, and who you work for and stuff. These guys, one of the Cubans stands up when he's asked what his job is. He says anti-communist. That's his response. And when when asked James McCord, who he used to work for, who he works for, he sort of tries to whisper, so reporters in the courtroom won't hear. He tries to say, like, the Central Intelligence Agency, and the judge just like, speak up, what? Yeah, so
Oh
it's just
man,
it's a bit pathetic in some
farcical.
ways.
Yeah.
But Nixon realizes that maybe this isn't, that the FBI think that it's a CIA job, that's an angle he can exploit to get the FBI to turn their investigation off. So he gives Haldeman pretty specific instructions to go to the CIA. The head of the CIA is a guy called Richard Helms. Go to Dick Helms and tell him to tell
Dick
the
Helms.
FBI. Yeah.
Jesus
Dick Helms.
Christ. Right. Okay.
Some of these names are crazy. There's one guy, a really minor guy, he's not important, but his name's Wally Johnson.
Excellent.
Yeah, so he asks Haldeman to tell the CIA to get the FBI to back off. And he says, he refers to any weird undercover stuff that this White House might have been working on as hanky-panky. And that it's in the CIA's interest to keep it covered up because, quote, if you uncover that scab, you don't know what you'll turn up. And he instructs Haldeman to, quote, play it tough. That's how they'll play it. Later in his memoirs, Nixon claims he wasn't even talking about the FBI, he was talking about the Democrats. But that makes no sense if you actually listen to the tape. That makes no sense whatsoever. And they're kind of banking on the fact that it's a complicated story. He says, I'll tell the CIA that it's a comedy of, quote, a comedy of errors, bizarre without getting into it, quote. And that the president, is just asking that for the good of the country, for the good of national security. Hunt may have been involved in the whole Bay of Pig things, which was obviously an embarrassment for the CIA.
Yeah.
So, do that. So anyway, Haldeman goes around. As far as I can tell, that same day has a meeting with Dick Helms and Walters, the deputy head of the CIA. And apparently Helms just says, well, no, it's nothing to do with the CIA. I know everything we've got that's going on, and this has nothing to do with us. So Haldeman sort of ups the ante and says, yeah, well, it might open up the Bay of Pig thing. And apparently Dick Helms sort of explodes a bit at that point. What do you mean? Has this got to do anything to do with the Bay of Pigs? What are you talking about?
Something like 10 years earlier, like.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really grasping at straws. Yeah, that's just terrible. I mean, oh man, I can't believe I didn't realise Nixon behaved so dumb about it.
Yeah, like I say, it's not the act of this politically astute puppet master, is it at all? It's like
Clearly,
a
the CIA
haphazard.
guy, yeah, like a CIA guy would go, like, why? What's in it for me? Like, not just to go. Can you step in? Can you somehow sort this out for me? Like, why would anyone do that unless they had a real good reason? Not like, oh, that thing that the CIA messed up years ago under a previous administration.
Yeah.
Doesn't make any sense at all, does it? Like, of course they weren't going to do anything about it. That they shouldn't even be doing anything on American soil anyway, right? So for them to go near it in any way would be insane.
Yeah, there was a thing called, what is it? I'm probably getting this wrong, but it's something like a Dissimulation agreement or something like that, where there'd been for years, apparently, an unspoken pact between the FBI and the CIA to sort of not investigate each other's stuff.
Nice, yeah.
Yeah, and something I didn't know, but, you know, the FBI and the CIA are in competition with each other. You know, they don't necessarily working towards the same ends at all.
No, well, they've got different responsibilities, but sort of overlapping responsibilities. Especially like the whole war on terror thing now. You know, domestic versus foreign responsibilities and all the rest of it. Again, going by my extensive research into Tom Clancy novels, that they don't get on.
Yeah. But I mean, that is the smoking gun when the prosecutors finally get the tape of Nixon saying to Haldeman, get the CIA to back the FBI off. That's obstruction of justice.
Wow.
And Nixon had a few supporters by that late stage, and they had to publicly just say, okay, the jig is up.
Yeah, and that's the smoking gun quote, is it? Like, is that the bit?
Yeah, when he's like, tell them it's a comedy of errors, bizarre without getting into it, and it's a matter of national security. It wasn't a matter of national security.
No.
So that's obstruction of justice and conspiracy, I think, as well.
Yeah, so that's it. Boom.
Did I approve the Ellsberg thing? Huh? You know, I'm glad we tape all these conversations because I never approved the breaking into Ellsberg's. Or maybe I approved it after the fact. Someday we gotta start transcribing these tapes.
You approved that before the fact because I went over it with you.
Yeah, but of course, no one's gonna see these tapes. But...
That's right. And it's really more of a problem for Ehrlichman. He's the one who fixed Hunt up with the phony CIA IDs, but what else does Hunt have on us?
You gotta turn off the FBI, Bob. Or you go to the CIA and tell Holmes that Howard Hunt is blackmailing the president. Tell him Hunt and his Cuban friends know too damn much, and if he goes public, if Hunt goes public, it will be a fiasco for the CIA. He'll know what I'm talking about.
All right.
Play it tough. That's the way they play it, and that's the way we're gonna play it. Don't lie to Holmes and say there's no involvement. Just say this is sort of comedy of errors, bizarre, without getting into it, and say the president believes it's going to open up the whole Bay of Pigs thing again. Now tell Holmes he should call the FBI, call Pat Gray, and say that we wish, for the sake of the country, that don't go any further into this hanky-panky. Period.
Bay of Pigs? That was Kennedy's screw-up. Why would that threaten us?
Just do what I say, Bob.
The only problem with that, sir, it does get us into obstruction of justice.
It's got nothing to do with justice, Bob. It's national security.
How is this national security?
The president says it is.